The 22nd of March 1144 was Holy Saturday, the day before Easter. Outside the city walls, the forester Henry de Sprowston was riding through Thorpe Wood on the outskirts of Norwich, England. Among other things, Henry was looking for thieves who were known to cut timber without permission. Suddenly, he came across a peasant who led him to the mutilated body of a young boy lying under a tree. Needless to say, it was pretty obvious that a crime had been committed. The boy's name was William, and no one could have imagined that the discovery of his body would lead to the first ever example of a ritual murder charge, with horrific consequences that would echo down the centuries. Welcome to Medieval Madness. The body. Henry wasn't the first person to come across the corpse of 12-year-old William. Lady Lagarda, a Norman aristocratic nun, had chosen to go back to her convent and say some prayers for the boy rather than alert the authorities, seemingly unworried by the experience. The peasant who informed Henry about the body had probably only shown it to the forester to detract from his own wrongdoings. This is how life was in the Middle Ages. Death was everywhere, especially when England was in the middle of the civil war between Stephen and Matilda, the children of King Henry I. Vicious attacks were commonplace. Innocents were being hacked to death on highways, and abbeys were ransacked as criminals used the war as an excuse for violence. Even knights were cutting off their victims' noses and nailing them to trees. Henry, who worked for the Bishop of Norwich, became responsible for the investigation into the death. With the help of people from the community, the boy was identified as William, a young apprentice leathermaker, and he was buried beneath the tree at the site of his murder. Within a couple of weeks, the boy's family accused the local Jews of murdering William. The boy's uncle, who was a priest named Godwin Sturt, had identified the body, and he made the allegation public. For the most part, the townspeople gave the accusation little attention and ignored the rumours. Still, Bishop Everard of Norwich allowed Stewart to speak about the matter at an ecclesiastical meeting. The sheriff, a man named John de Chesney, was called upon, and the Jews were summoned to court, but because they were non-Christian, canon law held no jurisdiction over them. The Jews took protection in Norwich Castle, and because no one came forward with any evidence, William's death was considered unexplained. For the most part, despite the fuss made by the family, the townspeople of Norwich ignored the allegation, and the issue faded away. The writer. About 6 years passed, and then Brother Thomas of Monmouth, a Benedictine monk, arrived at the Priory of Norwich Cathedral. Little is known about Thomas, although we can assume from his surname that he came from the area of Monmouthshire in southeast Wales. This was a place of traditional storytelling and the home of the cleric Geoffrey of Monmouth, who helped to develop the tales of King Arthur. Thomas became obsessed with the story of Little William and decided to write his version of the account down. He began his chilling narrative, The Life and Passion of William of Norwich, and the consequences of this manuscript could never be imagined. The lies that it contained spread, and it became the blueprint of hundreds of later accusations that had a hand in the death of thousands, if not millions, of Jews in the coming years. It is likely no coincidence that by the time Thomas began his fanciful work, Little William's brother had also become a member of the cathedral priory. In fact, many of the men in the boy's Anglo-Saxon family were connected to the church in one way or another. His maternal grandfather was a priest, as was his uncle, his cousin was a deacon, and now his brother had become a monk. And we shouldn't forget how powerful and influential the Catholic Church was at that time. The Saint. Thomas's book is divided into 7 parts. The first section talks about the murder itself and how wonderful Little William was. William was described as a boy of unusual innocence, making him the perfect sacrificial victim. According to Thomas, a man went to see William's mother and offered to buy the boy so he could train him to be a cook in the home of an important neighbour. Money changed hands and William was taken away. The mention of this exchange was a deliberate attempt to draw parallels between what happened to Little William and what happened to Jesus when he was sold for 30 pieces of silver just before his death. Thomas points out other similarities between the boy and Christ throughout the book. The story continues as Little William was taken to the house of the Jews of Norwich. There, Thomas said he was murdered in a terrible way. His description of the boy's torture is particularly graphic and detailed. Thomas is at his most inventive when he recounts how the boy had a rope, quote, as thick as a little finger, tied around his head that had 5 knots in it to represent the 5 wounds of Jesus. A teasel was placed in his mouth and he was strung up between 2 posts and displayed in a mock crucifixion. Having shaved his head, they stabbed it with countless thorn points and made the blood come horribly from the wounds they made. Some of those present adjudged him to be fixed to a cross in mockery of the Lord's Passion. Then Thomas goes on to say the boy was cut down, placed in a sack, and his body was disposed of in Thorpe Wood. Thomas anti-Semitically writes that, quote, "Only a Jew would have taken it upon himself to kill the innocent in this way with such rash daring." The blame game. But the people of Norwich still don't believe the accusation, so Thomas has to create some sort of motive for the sacrifice. Why would the Jews want to murder a child in such a way? In the book's second part, Thomas explains that it's because they want to mock the crucifixion, and that every year around the Jewish festival of Passover, which coincides with Easter, the time little William was killed, Jews apparently try to find, kidnap, torture, and kill Christian children. Thomas writes that he knows that this is true because he spoke to a monk called Theobald of Cambridge at the monastery, who was once a Jew but had converted to Christianity. The Jews, he said, were sacrificing children all over the place in some sort of international conspiracy, because it has been foretold in a vision that doing this is the only way for them to return to the Holy Land. This anti-Semitic and completely false story of Jews murdering Christians to use their blood in religious rituals is called a blood libel, and is how Thomas rationalizes turning a child murder victim into a saint. 12th century England. There is no record of the Jews in England until they arrive with the Norman conquest of 1066. In Norwich in the 1130s, there was a community of around 200 Jews who lived together in the French-speaking area of the city close to Norwich Castle. Jews were not allowed to own land or work in any capacity except for medicine. This limited them to the occupation of money lending, but as far as the Catholic Church was concerned, lending money and charging interest was the sin of usury. Ironically, the only work the Jews were allowed to do was also a very lucrative one, and that also caused a great deal of resentment. During the reign of Henry I of England in the early 12th century, a royal charter was granted, and Jews were permitted to freely move around the country as they represented the king in financial matters. As in mainland Europe, they were regarded as the king's property. There was tension around Christianity and Judaism. Anything seen as not following the beliefs of the Catholic Church was treated as suspect in medieval Europe. The accusation of ritual murder was an important step in the progressively hostile attitude towards members of the Jewish community. The Jews were newcomers, having only arrived in Norwich as well as the rest of England a few decades earlier, and resentment towards them increased. They became regarded as a threat, as enemies of Christ and Christianity, especially by the time of the boy's murder, which happened at the tail end of a disastrous Second Crusade against the Islamic forces of the Turkoman leader Zengi. The cult. Now that Thomas had connected little William to Jesus and claimed he was a saint, and that there was an international conspiracy to kill Christian children and use their blood in rituals, he spent the next 5 parts of his book describing the healing miracles that the boy had performed since his untimely death. It was because of these miracles that William's body was first moved to the churchyard, then to the chapter house, and then to the high altar. The healings continued around his tomb, which was decorated with candles and carpet. A cult built up around the boy, so his body was placed in a special chapel dedicated to the martyrs, and special artwork was commissioned. It's possible that Bishop Thurb, Bishop Everett was now retired, went along with the story for the monetary value. It was not uncommon for children to be venerated as saints after their death in 12th century England. Having a saint in residence was a lucrative business for a medieval cathedral. Everett was well connected, and that probably helped in the spread of and acceptance of the story. Theobald the Convert of Cambridge was not even in Norwich at the time that little William died. There is no record of a monk named Theobald ever living at Norwich Cathedral Priory, and although according to Thomas he described himself as a Jew among Jews when he lived in Cambridge, there wasn't a Jewish community there in 1144, that came much later. If Theobald really did exist, it's possible he made up the story to ingratiate himself into the Christian monastic community to better fit in. As for Thomas himself, his life seems to have found meaning once he began to initiate the boy's cult, and it could have been for no other reason than to promote his saint for self-interest and celebrity. Initially written in Latin, the book became so influential that it was translated into many other languages, causing a devastating effect across Europe, as the template was adapted and twisted for other accusations of ritual murder, sometimes against whole communities. In 1171, the abbot of Mont Saint-Michel in France reported on the burning of Jews in Blois for child murder. He concluded that, quote, "It is said they frequently kill children at Easter time if they have the opportunity." In 1255, 19 English Jews were executed in Lincoln after the death of another boy. The accusation that Jews killed Christian children to use their blood for ritual purposes and to mock Christ has never been proven, and no charge has ever stood up to historical scrutiny. Jewish law actually prohibits the consumption of blood. The accusations appeared all over Europe from medieval times into the Muslim world and down through the centuries. Thomas's book, one that most people have never heard of, changed the world by spreading fear and hatred. There is evil in the world, it is messy, everybody wants someone to blame, and trying to make sense of a tragedy by inventing conspiracy theories is never a good idea. In the end, the evidence points to the existence of a boy named William. He died a violent death, and his body was found in Thorpe Wood, Norwich in 1144. Everything else is just supposition. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Medieval Madness. Please do subscribe if you're enjoying these videos, and I'll see you next Friday for another one. Until then, I hope you have an awesome week. Cheers!